I'm Paolo Vines, I work at Imperial College in London. I do work on the causes of diseases in general and specifically on climate change with the Grantham Institute. Climate change is a reality, it is happening, it is serious, and it is definitely due to human activities, including energy production, transportation, even the production of food, because the production of meat is responsible for the emission of 20% of greenhouse gases. Well, we have severe implications, so to say acute, like floods, the drought, which itself has then consequences for food production. But we also have long-term consequences. For example, the spread of viruses. We have to think at such phenomena, including migration, also from the perspective and the angle of climate change.
Climate change is increasingly being recognised as an issue of health inequalities. We're expecting by 2050 for climate change to be the single most important cause of people fleeing their homes, with about 200 million refugees for climate change alone. Out of the top 10 countries that will be affected by climate change most severely, we're expecting that 7 of these will be in sub-Saharan Africa. The UK is among the least vulnerable countries to the effects of climate change. Underprivileged communities in high-income countries are very vulnerable to climate change already. From a public health perspective, we can draw parallels between climate change and environmental health issues. One of these, for example, is the disproportionate exposure to toxicity for people in underprivileged groups. For example, if you are of black or ethnic minority groups, you are more likely to be exposed to air pollution in your local area. Your children are more likely to have higher levels of lead in their blood. And as a woman, generally in the world in the near future, you're more likely to bear the direct effects. So climate change is really posing a question, not just how do we resolve it, but also what sort of world do we want to imagine.
I look at the role of climate in shaping the distribution of diseases, things like dengue fever, yellow fever, Zika virus even. We've looked at the way that climate change might influence the distribution of the vector of these diseases, and what we found is that there is quite an impact that the disease vector can shift around as in response to these changes in climate. There are some areas that are becoming generally more suitable to support that vector that would have a higher chance of being able to remain here. While we will be affected in Europe, by far the biggest influences and the biggest impacts are going to occur in poorer parts of the world. 75% of the world's land surface has significant pressure from humans, and compared to a world where humans don't exist, if we go back in the distant past and we think about biodiversity and how biodiversity has changed, we've seen a loss of something in the order of about 13 or 14% in total species richness, which is enormously significant at a global scale.
So why is climate change a threat to the biodiversity? We've seen rapid rise in Earth's temperature, which has been associated with mass extinction events. The problem now is that we're driving that process. So we produced huge changes, and yes, just as these changes before have driven mass extinction events, it's very likely to do it again, but we'll be in the middle of those. We sit atop a very wobbly pyramid, and we're chipping away at the base of that pyramid, which will ultimately collapse with us at the top of it. So when you take a breath now, or anyone watching this video take a breath now, they're the first humans ever to have breathed in that concentration of greenhouse gases. The problem is that we've been adding them very quickly. Several hundred million years worth of carbon was drawn out of the atmosphere by small organisms and plants, which rather than decaying and releasing that carbon, were crushed, and that carbon was stored in what we now know to be fossil fuels, so oil, gas, or coal. And really in the last 150 years, and very little more, we've suddenly started burning those at absolutely colossal rates. Colossal rates. The first jet aeroplane ticket commercially was only sold a little over 50 years ago, and I'm certainly old enough to remember the jet set, these fabulously rich people who could afford an aeroplane ticket, and now 98 people board an aeroplane every second. The first home PC was only sold in 1973, but there are now more mobile phones on the planet than there are people. We are changing the climate at an alarming rate through the production of these greenhouse gases. That will trap more radiant heat, and it will mean that the Earth will warm. And you can model, do the mathematics of how much energy gain that might be. It works out to be currently around 5 Hiroshima bombs worth of energy a second being added to our climate system.
4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Now, if that's true, you would expect to see a few things happening. The first is you might expect the temperature of lower parts of the atmosphere to start rising. And we have seen that huge volumes of ice being melting, particularly in the Arctic. If you add energy to a climate system, weather will become more energetic. You will get more extreme weather events, more density of rainfall, greater precipitation in some areas, and you were seeing some of that in the Antarctic, where that rainfall comes as snow. As you warm oceans, they hold less CO2. As you melt ice, it reflects less light. As you melt tundra, it releases methane, 23 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than is carbon dioxide. Loss of habitat and poverty come from those extreme weather events. Those sorts of things lead to conflict. Migration leads to conflict, and conflict leads to loss of life as well, let alone the issues related to biodiversity. Climate change is the greatest threat to human health in the 21st century.
My name is Salim ul Haq. I'm Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based at the Independent University here in Dhaka in Bangladesh. Almost all the impacts of climate change, from floods, cyclones, sea level rise, even drought in parts of the country, exist in Bangladesh. We have a very high level of poverty and many poor people. That makes Bangladesh one of the most vulnerable countries. It has a very dense population of 150 million people in 144,000 square kilometers, which is over 1,000 people per square kilometer, which by some definitions is the definition of a city. If you look at the last 100 years, then 8 out of 10 of the biggest floods, biggest droughts, biggest typhoons have happened in the last 10 years.
Why these coastal areas are especially very vulnerable has a number of reasons, and one of them is that, for example, the coastal areas are very low-lying, they're deltaic areas. And because the Bay of Bengal is horseshoe-shaped, which might elevate the height of waves if the coastal area is attacked by a tropical cyclone, for example. You can imagine that that has caused a lot of damage in the livelihoods of the people living in the coastal areas. But besides the fact that their houses might be damaged, there's obviously an increased risk in drowning, and some of the infectious diseases such as malaria and dengue fever have become more incident. It also exacerbated the problem of salinity in the area. We all know that too much salt on a daily basis is not very good for your health. The concentrations that we have measured in the drinking water in coastal Bangladesh are so high. So that means that people already exceed the WHO maximum guideline on sodium intake just by drinking water. There's many studies about the causal effect of high sodium intake and several cardiovascular diseases, high blood pressure, but also the risk of strokes, for example, or coronary heart disease. And in a study that we've done, we see that indeed the people drinking very high salty sources do have, on average, a much higher blood pressure than those that drink from, for example, rainwater sources. And in pregnant women, we found that it is associated with preeclampsia, which is a condition in pregnancy that is characterized by high blood pressure as well. When we were conducting the research in Bangladesh and talked a lot to the local population, it seemed that what they were mainly concerned about was that the salinity was affecting their crops and their income, of course. In pregnant women, this was slightly different because they go to the clinic for antenatal checkups. So for them, we knew that they were having these high blood pressure problems, and this was also documented and talked through by the doctor.
This is one of the most unstoppable impacts of climate change. You see it initially as salinity increase, and then it becomes land being totally inundated to the sea. And we've seen that happen right now in Bangladesh. There are probably about 10 to 20 million people living in coastal areas in Bangladesh who are drinking saline water as we speak. They can't perceive it anymore because they drink it all the time. But if you and I were to go there and drink it, it will taste saline. And that's what they drink. They have to. They have no choice.
From a very recent study which I did looking at links between disasters, climate change and migration. Almost 100% of the people I spoke to, they're all climate migrants. They have all come here because they have lost their land. They have all come here because they've lost their crops. And they would come to Dhaka to pull rickshaws or something. It's like falling from the pan to the fire because they're coming from a rural area where everything is devastated. Crops are gone, his fish is gone, everything is gone. And then they're coming to Dhaka, and if you see some of the areas they live in Dhaka, I don't know a word to describe it. This woman I went to talk to, so my first question was, where are you from? And she's laughing, and I'm like, why are you laughing? My village has gone. And as a profession, she collects bottles and plastic from a huge pile of garbage, and that's her profession because she couldn't really get anything else to do. There's all these like secondary and other effects of climate change which needs to be understood, first of all, and which needs to be addressed.
In the history of development, the issue of finite resources was already brought up in the 1970s, for example, by several scientists who were calling out the fact that it's quite illogical to keep developing our economies based on extracting finite resources. But it's taken a while for those voices to be heard, and I think more importantly, those voices actually echo other types of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, for example.
As you see on the screen, scientists have developed the global calculator based on a mathematical model that can be used essentially to estimate the impact of different habits and greenhouse gases production. So by changing certain parameters, which can be how you eat, healthy food versus unhealthy, which ways of transportation you use, which energy production ways you refer to, you get a different estimate of the CO2 emissions or greenhouse gases emissions in the atmosphere, and so also of the likelihood that our goals in terms of mitigation of climate change are met, like less than 2 degrees increase in temperature by 2030.
My work is focused on using simulation tools, essentially computer simulation models, to look at the ways that our global energy system could actually develop from its current situation, whereby we extract a lot of fossil fuels from the ground and use those as our primary sources of energy, to a future system which doesn't rely so much on the combustion of fossil fuels and the associated large-scale carbon dioxide emissions that go with that. And those future energy systems would rely on a range of technologies like renewables, so solar and wind and hydropower, on very low carbon sources of heating like electric heat pumps, and on very low carbon vehicles, so electric vehicles for example. And the models that I use look at how the evolution of the energy system might happen based on assumptions of how much those technologies that don't emit CO2 cost now and in the future, and how their deployment and availability will actually develop over the coming decades. The simulation tools are getting more and more sophisticated as the years go on. As we learn more about innovation and how technologies develop, as we learn more about behaviours and how people become more or less efficient in their use of energy. These models really focus predominantly on the technology and economic aspects, but there are clearly social and political aspects of this challenge of decarbonising our society as well, and there I think we have to learn an awful lot more.
If you look at the global calculator and you try to make estimates based on it, The fact that acting on food has a big impact, more than people thought before. So shifting from a lot of meat or unhealthy food towards healthy food really has an important impact on climate change. If you act in certain sectors, you can get benefits in both the climate change field and for health. Weight is due to the balance between the intake of calories and physical exercise. So a simple way to explain it is that we have increased our calories, caloric intake, and decreased physical exercise. Most of our activities now are facilitated by machines. And the problem is that obesity is steeply increasing in all countries, and including developing countries, and this is really a matter for concern. We should talk about also the role of the food industry, because obviously the cheapest food is also the most obesogenic. We know that these advertisements are particularly for low social class. It is an individual responsibility, but also it is a responsibility of the state, of the governments, and of industries. So deforestation is one side effect of meat production, and deforestation itself then leads to other side effects, because we know that increased contacts between humans and wildlife is responsible for the spread of certain viruses. We know that now there are new viral diseases emerging, and part of this is due to deforestation. The message is that limiting meat intake is good for your health for several reasons, and it is also good for climate change. It is easy to reduce meat intake.
We must empower leaders who not only believe in climate change but are willing to do something about it. If you do not believe in climate change, you do not believe in facts or in science or empirical truths, and therefore, in my humble opinion, should not be allowed to hold public office.
Do you believe in global warming, climate change? It'll go up, it'll get a little cooler, it'll get a little warmer like it always has for millions of years. It'll get cooler, it'll get warmer. It's called weather.
We have renewable energy companies, very fast growing, that are doing good business out of solving the climate change problem. Valuing these fossil fuel companies at trillions of dollars based on the asset, the so-called asset they have in the ground. If that asset cannot be brought out and burnt, and we will not let them bring it out and burn, then that asset is not worth anything. So you better get out of fossil fuels and into something better, and that campaign of divestment from fossil fuel is actually picking up steam, and it has the fossil fuel companies very, very worried.
In order for people to adapt to climate change, big behavioral change. The best way is to educate. The person has a right to space, has a right to land, to good quality air, and they're beautiful words, but then people don't understand them because people are not educated. The perfect people to target is children, because they pick up information, they're young minds. Whatever you teach them, they'll accept it and they'll act on it. Before you do that, nothing will happen.
When the lights go out in New York, chaos happens. When lights go out in Dhaka, nothing happens. Okay? We're used to it. It happens every day. So we can teach the rich how to be resilient to the impacts of climate change. We've moved the narrative from being victims to being proactive warriors. And not only are we tackling it, we are willing to help the rest of the world tackle it as well. What we need is political will that you generate in times of war. And this is a war. This is a war by the climate against planet Earth. And we need to see it as that. We need to galvanize ourselves. 6 billion people, 200 countries, all of us have a collective enemy called the climate change. We need to fight it as a war.